Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land today. We're on Darug land, and I'd like to pay my respects to our elders, both past and present. Today, Shiri Hergass is going to present her confirmation of candidature, and her thesis is based on conducting art therapy classes with traumatised children, majority who are Aboriginal children. So welcome, Shiri, and thank you.
Thank you. So, my name is Shiri. I'm a clinical social worker and an art therapist and a group facilitator, and I have been for the last 18 years. I started my social work journey in Israel, in a development city in the northern border of Israel, where there were a lot of vulnerable, complex families who, on top of their individual trauma, had to... Sorry, I've got to catch my breath. I'm very excited to be here. Very nervous to be here. These families, on top of having to deal with their own individual trauma, had to deal with the reality of living in a war zone. And I spent many hours in bomb shelters with little children and families. And what I found was talk therapy was just not sufficient. It was not appropriate. And I came into the shelters with a little brown suitcase full of art materials, puppets, and this led me to look into other modalities of therapy, and I went to study art therapy afterwards. I worked with Ethiopian immigrants who not only had a very difficult time in Ethiopia, but the immigration process was very difficult, and settling in Israel was really traumatic. I worked with Bedouins in the south of Israel, and I managed a parent and child centre for families with very high risk. This was their last opportunity to actually work on keeping the family as a whole before having the children removed. And I also managed a reconciliation project where Palestinians and Jews sat together, social workers, to try and work through conflicts. What I found is that art fills the gaps where words couldn't. Art gave colour and shape to things that were just unmentionable, and it created a bridge that allowed me to cross and meet people of different cultures. It was non-threatening, and it allowed healing to occur. 8 years ago, I immigrated to Australia, and one of the first things I did was designed and implemented a group for women and the babies that stay in Emu Plain jails. And I have a private practice where I get a lot of referrals of vulnerable, complex families from Department of Children's Services, of FACS, SDN, which is Sydney's Children's Services. I do a lot of work with foster care, and I also managed for the last 7 years a rural project in a non-profit organisation called Ganawira, where we worked with 43 preschools in outback New South Wales. And through Ganawira, I worked with traumatised educators and therapists who themselves worked with traumatised families. The work was actually twofold. On the one hand, it involved creating and designing programs to work with these children and families, to make programs that had a real impact. And it was also to work with these facilitators who are going to run these programs to help them work and process their own trauma so that they have some space and capacity to work with these families and children. And again, I know what to do now. So, using art as a therapeutic medium helped create a foundation upon which all the caregivers and families could express themselves. And I just want to say a bit about this picture. In Inverell, a lot of families would not access preschools because it is linked to organisation, it's linked to institutionalised. And what we did is we went into the park every week, but I came there once a month, and created an art program. And it started with 2 or 3 families, and by the end of the year we had 20 and 30. And what was really phenomenal is that the fathers or partners of these families came and joined, and it opened up a lot of discussion just about their own stories and life. During the work with Ganawira, I saw firsthand the result of transgenerational trauma. You see children that are very eager to use the preschool as best as they can, but also you see kids who have already at this age, and I'm talking 5 months to 5 years, who have already experienced trauma that, all their curiosity, their imagination and play, they could just not access it. You go into a preschool, what do you expect to see? You expect to see little children in little outfits, they're playing, everything's fun, experimental, there's a lot of joy. But actually reality was very, very different. You'd see small children sitting in the corner, completely invisible. And the reason they're invisible is because they're not troubling anyone. Or on the opposite extreme, you see kids that are running around in a frenzy without any meaning or control, as if this hyperness was just a way to stop their own pain and feeling. And again, later through the work, we recognize that this is all just symptoms of trauma. With the teachers of these preschool, what originally we thought would be fatigue or malaise, we came to recognize it's really a response to receiving trauma from the children, and they were often very unconscious of this. So the hidden projection of children's trauma actually presented itself as a nothingness, a non-happening. And we recognized again after speaking with them that this was a mask. So this is one of a preschool teacher, educator, and she did this, and what she said at the end of it is, all this colorness and busyness outside, it helps hide the emptiness I feel inside. And when you open the boxes, it's bare. And we recognize that all this tiredness, fatigue, overwhelm of the educators really was just a mask, again, to cover all this mess of emotions that they've experienced. And this is another teacher who created this. And she said, when I get to preschool, what I do is I put on my teacher face. And then I look inside and really, really try to connect to the love before I see these children. So all these experiences, seeing the kids, speaking with the educators, is what prompted me to design this model that I'll be presenting today. Because what I wanted to look at is how to use art therapy as a safe space in which the teachers can reflect on their own work to assist kids who have gone through trauma. Oops, I'm missing a slide. This is just before I move into trauma. This is another workshop we had with the educators, and she wrote this, and this is one of the educators that was one of the directors people really looked up to, and she did this tree, and she says, actually, I feel just like this tree, bare, lifeless, dark, and hopeless. And there was silence in the room. And a few minutes later, other directors and educators went, we really resonate with this. This is actually what we have been feeling. Trauma. So what does trauma do? Trauma destroys our capacity for fantasy. It kills the space inside our mind to create. It actually kills our dreaming. And what it does create is this internal autistic space, a complete void. And it's very recognized today that trauma, experiences of different trauma during childhood really have very long and severe effects over a lifetime. And Perry and Van der Kolk and Shore are just a few of the researchers that speak about the traumatic experience that lead to things such as developmental challenges, problems with speech, impulsivity, attention deficit disorder, difficulties in school, on the spectrum. And the reason I mention this is a lot of the preschools that I work with or go to, many of the kids have these. And often it is, again, just a result of the trauma that they have experienced. So at the center of trauma is a violent emotion of the child's capacity to suffer. Trauma really involves fear in its most primal form. It's a feeling of helplessness that nobody can help, save, or protect you or your loved ones. And this overwhelming fear, it stops the thinking, it stops symbolization, and what is left is really this non-living space, where thought could be if it could be thought, and knowing would be if it could be known. And Freud and Tustin and Tracy are three of researchers who really speak about this autistic core and the effects of trauma. Trauma does not have to result from maltreatment, neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, all the things we associate with it. Verbal abuse could definitely can't and has been known to leave the same effects. And also, an event or an experience that can happen to a family or to a community can impact the child in the same way. So actually what trauma is, it's this interactive, interchanging phenomena in which the trauma of the individual child really affects the family, and the family trauma, community trauma, really affects the child. And I'm just going to share this again because this is a 4-year-old boy, but a lot of his artwork is just that. And speaking to the great auntie, she said when she got him at 1, he was covered in bugs, but really what we heard was feces. The Aboriginal people have gone through horrific colonisation, genocide, and stolen generations is an extreme example of trauma that has been affecting communities, families and children across several generations, both physically and psychologically. Children of the stolen generations were separated from their families, institutionalized, physically abused, sexually abused and psychologically mistreated. There's a lot of research again today, the Human Rights and Equals reports, the Stolen Generations reports, Atkinson, that show that a lot of that anger, substance abuse, ill health later on in life, short life tendencies, self-harm, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, getting into jails and being in trouble with the law are all really a result of this trauma. And these layers of abuse and violence have created what Judy Atkinson calls transgenerational trauma. And you can see this picture, I don't need to explain it. I just want to say this, on the left-hand side, that rectangle is this little girl's own room. But through her work, she's been working on Mum's Messy Room. And you cannot see it there, but this is what Mum's Messy Room looks like. So there's a lot of processing of transgenerational trauma through the art. And the implications of it today are very well known. The Western Australian study of Aboriginal health says that 35% of Aboriginal children were living in families impacted. And I can tell you I've been in at least 50 preschool. And there's not one preschool that I've been to that there were not 5 or more kids who have been forcibly removed from the families. It's mind-blowing. It's a huge amount of kids that are still affected to this day. And just before I move on, there's a woman by the name of Rachel Yehuda who does research in New York. It's Epigenetic Inheritance. And what she has found out is she's looked at Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren that don't necessarily live with them or in the same country. And what she's found is that the DNA of the body actually changes as a result of trauma. And so this is a very clear way of seeing how transgenerational trauma affects the next generation. Van der Kolk established that when you re-experience trauma, whether you imagine it, whether you visualize it, the right side of the brain, which is the Broca area, it really has a very intensified activity, and this areas really responsible for emotional arousal. So when you experience trauma, this right area of the brain is very active, and what it does is it hinders relationships, acknowledging other people as whole people, and really affects the communication and perception. So really what trauma does is it fragments the person's sense of the whole. It's as if it splinters in the memories and the stories of the person. And what researchers found that if you have a safe space with a secure relationship within that space, and using art can really recreate those stories to create a sense of wholeness. And this way of healing trauma through stories and using art really links with Aboriginal concepts of dreamtime, narrative, and art making. I keep saying safe space, safe space, safe space. I'm just going to very briefly touch on a few points here to explain that safe space. So Beyond says that in order for humans to process thoughts and experiences, what they really require is an emotional intimacy. It's that connection with the child, and that creates a safe space. And within that safe space, we have a few things. So there's projective identification. If a mother or an educator sees a child in distress and can stay present in that distress of her infant and not become overwhelmed, not become withdrawn in her own story, but see that this has got to do with the child's physical and emotional needs, then the child can develop this secure sense of self that will later allow him to explore the world. Mentalization. Infants only become independent subjects if their carer sees them as such. So if a carer sees a little baby as somebody who's got a mind of, is their own feeling of their own, then the child can grow up to become that. And this happens when a baby is just born, when they don't really have a mind of their own. But there is that separation from the carer to the baby. And mirroring, where the self of sense is developed through the gaze of the caretaker. Winnicott says there's no such a thing as an infant. If you set out to describe a baby, you will find you're describing a baby and somebody. A baby cannot exist alone, but it's essentially a part of a relationship. And what happens with educators is sometimes that they're very scared by a young child's aggression. Rather than thinking, oh well, this is a normal process of development. So an example could be when a young boy is labelled by an educator as being very aggressive. What happens is often unconsciously, this boy will take on this identification and it'll become a part of him, so he'll think of himself as aggressive or violent or bad or dangerous, and that could lead to a downward spiral. So taken together, these ingredients compromise key components of infant mental health. And we talk a lot about the good enough. So last night, I'll just give an example. I was very stressed trying to work on these presentations, and it's a miracle how these children sort of recognize when you're not available. And my little one became very clingy and very noisy and very much on top of me. So if I was to go through all of those, I would have been aware that it's nothing to do with me, she has her own needs. I would have been very available to her and not felt like I was freaking out and that she was enclosing my step. And this is a one-time off, but with these parents who are depressed, who have been through trauma, whenever the child does anything, it really just stirs their own distress. Why art? Words do not have a major base for children. Their medium is dance, song, music, and art. And what happens is art actually becomes the communication so that the witnessing of trauma can occur through it. It really does help communicate not only what sometimes is hard to put into words, but a lot of what is pre-verbal. So there really are no words to these experiences. And drawing it can help a child feel seen and acknowledged. It builds trust and it builds relationship. So this picture of the car, they were scribbling and they had stickers of cars, and they turned this into a game where kids started to interact and speak with each other, where before they weren't doing it in school. Art is a safe outlet for feelings such as fear, guilt, pain, rage, excitement. So this little girl had an imaginary friend called Grace, and she did a lot of pictures for Grace. And she created a lot of new houses and a car for her and beautiful surrounding. And what I found out is this little girl was moving to a new house. And this is one of the functioning girls in the preschools. But everybody was so excited about the move because it was into a 4-bedroom house, into a better neighborhood, that she never had a chance to even process it and talk about it. And she was actually really mourning the loss of her old house that she loved. This picture, so on the left, that mush, this is a boy that lives in horrific domestic violence, and he used most of the art sessions to just squeeze paint. And again, instead of throwing and bashing the preschool room, throwing chairs and hitting other kids, he would come in and he would squish a lot of paint onto cardboard for many sessions. And at the end of the sessions, his artworks already began to change into something that had a bit more structure to it. One of the unique gifts the Aboriginal people had is art, and it triggers an imagining. And it is in this imagining that is allowed to be reawakened. And this is the healing of fermentation. Aboriginal art has changed from its traditional form, but it's still recognized as a powerful and a dramatic way of expressing culture. For Aboriginal people, Aboriginal art reflects country, land, place, knowledge, culture, and identity. This needs to be in inverted commas. Our art is diverse with a range of styles and media to tell ancient stories and to show new insight in a modern world. Fusing knowledge and culture, art empowers Aboriginal people with a voice and an undeniable presence. That's Fabri. This is really huge. We are the art. We are the culture. We are the land. Please respect us. We know the history. There's genocide, stolen generations, there's hideous treatment, we know it. We talk a lot about trauma, but do we really, really understand it? And the implications of it? Linda Tui Smith says that when we go in, either as researchers or therapists, there is always a danger that we may be ourselves colonizing again. So we really have to stand back and respect Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. We need to develop the capacity to step outside ourselves. And you know, I always thought art therapy was non-intrusive and non-threatening and a great bridge. But even that, we don't realize our own parts and how we come in. So if we come in what I call, through Margaret did a lot of reading about liminal spaces, you come into this void and you just wait to meet people, to see who they are. Just being aware of who you are in your own history, but just being very ready to accept whatever's going to come. So, there is a lot of psychotherapeutic case studies working with trauma, understanding trauma, but there's really very little information about educators experiencing in working with children who have had to deal with trauma. And hearing this firsthand, the need, this is what I wanted to look at closer. So the key aim of this research is to create and evaluate a model of working with traumatized children within a preschool setting. And the development of this model involves educators, both in the process of the design, participation, reflection, and the evaluation. And this is what it can look like, sitting on a group. Woman is an educator, it's two educators in a room with a facilitator. So central to the design of the program is the creation of a safe space, which I've been speaking about, for children to create alongside educators, so that the educators can really witness the experiences behind the children and understand it. They do not understand that sometimes the way the children behave is really just a result of their own distress. It is my experience that this safe space strengthens the relationship between the educators and the children, enhancing the capacity for both groups to have their needs met. Because children that feel heard and seen develop self-regulating capacities, and educators who have tools for dealing with disruptive behaviours are able to create a nourishing, safe space for learning. And this is phenomenal because there's an educator and a child, and what happened as part of this group is that the child started painting and touching and spending time with the educator, and it was the first time the educator really enjoyed it. And this is a child that has not communicated with them before, and the only interaction were around managing very disruptive behaviour of swearing and hitting in the school. So why do we do this? Basically because when children come to preschool, they bring with them their histories and their trauma. And in the preschools that I've been working with, a lot of the teachers have experienced trauma themselves. And having this non-judgmental relationship where both child and educator can have the pain and suffering not only heard and witnessed, but taken in and processed, it helps with neutralizing it, and it helps with the healing. I will use qualitative method to help identify range of factors that impact the educators working with children who have experienced trauma. And I chose this method to be able to obtain a rich description. It's exploratory in nature, and it seeks to uncover new information rather than coming in and testing an hypothesis. And I'll do the research in 2 stages. Stage 1 is art therapy group for the children themselves. And it'll focus on 5 to 10 children from preschool. And to obtain a great understanding of the children, the educators will actually pick which children will participate in the research. And the aims are to observe whether that autistic, non-creative space that I've been talking about that is caused by trauma can be brought back to life through the medium of communication, particularly art therapy, but we do a bit of drumming at the beginning and singing at the end. To observe if the creation and use of art actually allows for feelings to surface and to find an expression, and to observe if the art therapy group positively impacts the children's behaviour through school. And the procedure will be, we'll be running a 1-hour session for the duration of the term, so it's 10 sessions. It'll be in the children's preschool room with the educators who are the leaders of that room in the group. And the way I demarcate the art therapy group is I have this white throw rug that you've seen. I put it on the floor, and I always begin with a hello song, and I always end with a goodbye song. And this actually gives structure to the beginning and ending of the session. And I give the children a wide variety of art materials, different papers, and I do not give them a theme. I don't say today we're going to do this or that. I just bring this open creative space which is contained in the structure. So what the structure does is it gives security, but it doesn't impose on the children what to do or on their inner world. So it's up to them really to find what they want to express. That's the hello song. And just before the end of the goodbye song, children always have story time to talk about the artwork. So I'll be video recording the art therapy groups and the artworks just to assist in the development of this model, so that I can look at both the process and the outcome. The process is just as important as the outcome of the art materials. I will transcribe it and use in vivo. And I will use that phenomenological approach of Bitansky to look and assess the artwork and the themes. And she's a great way of assessing the process of the artwork. And after that, the second stage will be working with the educators. And again, the driver is here just to give educators who work with traumatized children tools and knowledge that can make a positive difference to the children while mitigating their own stress. Again, children of this age really rely very heavily on the development of relationship of trust with specific educators in order to self-regulate themselves and their own experiences. And if helping educators understand and look at behaviorally differently by providing them with emotional support and a reflective space, it may improve their abilities for empathic connection to these children. Because otherwise, educators are very overwhelmed and very lost and do not understand why children behave that way, and they just punish them, which increases the cycle. And this is educators doing art. So the aims are to evaluate the existing models of working with traumatized children, to enhance a greater understanding of how to work with traumatized children, to identify how working with trauma impacts the educators, because just being in the presence of trauma impacts a person, to understand the perceived impact of the program on educators' day-to-day work with traumatized children, to build an interactive, integrated model to help the educators link theory with the actual practice of the work, and to nurture confidence in the educators while they work with the children. There'll be 4 to 6 educators, and again, after the art therapy sessions, we'll go into a safe room where we can talk, and educators can both think about their own experience in the group, but bring whatever it is they want to bring, be it practical questions, and they will each get a visual diary in colours so that they can record their own artwork after the group. And they will have questions to answer each week just so that we can see if there is any changes in any process. And again, I will be recording this to allow analysis for both the outcome and the actual artwork. And I will use in vivo to collate major themes. I'll also speak with the director, because the director is an external person who's not involved in the group but's very aware of what's happening. So if I speak with her at the beginning and at the end of the group, it'll give a different perspective of what's happening. So the groups will be based on experiential, art-based, narrative-oriented method. I will use action research with an open-ended, semi-structured interviews for the educators and the director at the very beginning and at the end, just to give a better understanding of the educators' understanding of trauma and working with trauma and how it impacts their work. And of course, I will leave a degree of adaptability in my research, because we are working with people and we don't know what will come up. So we've always got to be very open for that. And the reason I put that pictures up is because we think we deal with people, and these are all stickers, and yet each child and each educator creates something completely different. So, from our discussion with educators, there is not a lot in the curriculum to support their work with vulnerable families. And this is a quote that reflects many that I hear from educators. I don't think I have the skills to work with these children. And let me tell you, this is 90% of the children in the preschool. This research will hopefully help in developing a model that the educators can find useful and referring back to, and using in the very complex but very important work. A lot of these children come to preschool at 6:30 in the morning and they leave at 6 o'clock at night. So the educators in a way are surrogate parents, which is why understanding and creating the safe space is so important. And ideally it will be a model that could be incorporated into their teaching education.
interesting topic, isn't it? And it's a remarkable topic, probably, Kate, which has come from all your experience, isn't it? So it's unusual in that sense, isn't it? That you have a very experienced sort of therapist coming with a project.
Yeah.
So that's rather exciting. In a sense, it's very exciting. No.
Can I ask a question about how it really works? Like you're talking about trauma, and it could be different kinds of trauma. And what I've heard so far is that art will help these people externalize their emotional disturbances inside, so that they are actually expressing themselves in art. But then the next thing that I've heard is about the communication, which I think is a crucial part. Instead of just doing the art per se, it is the communication with the educator who may give them some kind of feedback to make that.
So not so much feedback, but more listening and acknowledging before the feedback. So what happens is after the art making, we have story time, and the children share the stories of this artwork. So it could be something just, oh, this is a picture for my mummy, or it could be a full-on story, sort of like the imaginary friend Grace, where they project all their story onto Grace and they communicate it. But I think before that feedback is just real acknowledgement, and often it's the first time educators actually hear what these children are going through or what these children are feeling. Now, trauma is stored in the lower brain. Art accesses the lower brain, and once you've created it and you create a story, that's where it goes to the front brain of the, and that's where the processing happens. And I think, the expression is huge, because if a child can express like that kid on a paper, it means he doesn't go and literally breaks the school down. We have broken chairs, we have teachers that go home with bite marks and blue and black bruises. And I'm not making this up. So I think when the children communicate it first, and you have an educator who has a space to hear, to witness, and then the child feels more comfortable to express it, then you start a dialogue. But you cannot start a dialogue before the child actually, and I think this is part of what really links with the Aboriginal way of working, where you create a space and respect for the child to come up with their own words. But then the second stage is always that communication. That's actually what it does, is it links in the thinking with the actual trauma and expression. And what the reflection time with the educators will do is it'll give the educators both the tools but the capacity to listen and to be able to reflect back. Because often when we hear trauma, we want to just go and fix it. And we cannot fix anything, especially if things are still going on, especially if it's transgenerational. It's acknowledging, it's listening, and then reflecting back. And so I'm hoping that if the educators have their own safe space and they learn how to reply and just hear, then there's the dialogue, and that's where the feedback comes in. But you'll be amazed that just by acknowledgement and listening, often they don't have to say anything else. That in itself does the healing.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. So if I'm understanding it correctly, things start with something non-verbal, and it moves on to something more verbal.
And that's exactly the healing process. So it's from fragmentation, from dissociation, from creating blurbs that have no name. That poo, at the beginning, was not a poo. It was just this mush that he had to get out of the system in a way. And then the story started to come. And as the story starts to come, it's as if all these memories are coming back. So with a little bit older kids, you get these flashbacks, or adults. And it's these flashbacks that start connecting the memories. And that you create a sense of whole, and that's the healing. But and a lot of these times for educators who have gone through trauma is pre-verbal. So they've gone through things that a child, where they didn't have the words to understand what they're going through. Have 2 years old that have been removed after sexual abuse, neglect. They don't understand that at 2 years old. They don't have language to explain what happened to them, but they have the feeling in their body. And I think if they start creating it, then the words can come. And when the words comes, that's the link between the parts of the brain, and that's the healing.
I just want to talk a little bit about using in vivo, because I've long held a passion of trying to use video footage as well as narrative, and actually capturing non-verbal behaviour as well as, and being able to code it in all one system. So I was wondering about what sort of expertise you feel you have, or where you might get all that, because it's quite complex.
I went to one workshop.
Oh, good.
I was very delighted because before, when I did my masters, I used to cut and paste, and I had ages of footage, and the lecturer was really great, and it seemed very easy, and he was very open to ask for help. I think where it'll come in handy with the videos, you can just store it, and then you can copy paste, but I'm not going to be using the videos much for anything other than reflecting on the process, because when you're in a room, you've got to be very present, and I think I've learned over the years to identify a few things that happen, but stepping back, you always see different things, so it'll be more just to be able to reflect back and look where the themes come up, and then learn this in vivo as I go along. Sort of like I'm learning EndNote now with the references. But it looks like that the way we worked in that workshop is that you can actually put it on the program and save it and put it under themes along with audio, audio things, which looks like it could be a really great way, because the way I've been doing it now is really long. It takes hours to look at the footage and hours to separate it.
And you're sure it's will have a lot of footage.
And I'll have a lot of footage, but I think the process, this is the thing, a lot of people look at the outcome, and when you see a mush, it doesn't make any sense. But when you see a process, you can see, even if it's a mush at the beginning and at the end, you can understand how it works.
So it's going to be a reasonable challenge to get in how you present that data to be meaningful too.
I think the way I envision it, and it could completely change, I'm very aware of it, is to put on, like this, an artwork, or a process of different artworks, and the stories that come with them. That will help with confidentiality, but it will also help taking themes out, because there are a few themes that seem to come out of it, but the actual analysing process will be very long, and I have my fabulous supervisors and Judy Atkinson that will help look at the art and make, just that cultural appropriate thing.
I think even from that perspective, from method, it'll be the most exciting piece of work. From method, Yes. So I hope I can manage to get the pre-submission to see how you got on, because it is an amazing capacity in vivo to do that now. It's quite remarkable.
I'll definitely be using it for the video, and I'm hoping I'll be able to link the audio with it.
Yes, it does. Certainly, it has the capacity.
Yeah, you can put in pictures as well. So there's upskilling my IT tools. So you also wanted to ask? Okay.
I have a query, Shiri, about process, just as I'm hearing you present today. I was thinking, if you're dealing with children from collectivist culture who want to draw in together with other children rather than individually, how would you manage that?
So that picture of the car, that was such a beautiful example, and for me it meant that we moved on in a process. They usually start with something individual, so I'm just going to put it up because I know it looks like a scribble, but it was one of the most powerful moments in this preschool, because many of these children have horrific trauma. Some have developmental delays, some are on the spectrum, and the educators were shocked to start off that they were participating in a group, because they've never participated in everything. And after a few sessions, so they did that, and they all came to play. So again, for me, the process will be just putting it as one, a different theme. And I think it's It means that something has been processed from their own individual trauma that they can then communicate with others. And through that work on, not that this deals with it, but social skills and communications. And it will happen sometimes with educators as well. So they create their own things, but then they go with it to the educator and start an interaction around that.
Thanks.
Any questions?
Is this vicarious traumas faces? They were just very clear.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.